Welcome all of you here. My name is Gabriel Lozada. I'm a professor in the economics department, and our speaker today is Dean Baker, who, as you can see, is going to be talking about political economy of frac sand mining in southern Utah. Dean is new with the University of Utah this year, and so I very much look forward to this talk.
Thanks, Gabriel. Thank you all for coming. I really appreciate your listening to me on this because I can't pretend to be an expert on the frac sand industry. And to be quite honest, I didn't know there was a frac sand industry until we found out there might be a mine located next to us in southern Utah, where I now live. I knew of fracking, and I sort of knew that fracking required sand, but I sort of thought like you went down to the beach and got a couple buckets. I didn't realize like there's this massive industry involved in mining up the sand that you need for fracking, which is interesting and news to me. So let me give you the basic story. I'll say a little bit about the economics of the frac sand industry, which is fascinating. I'm not a fan of fracking, not a fan of the industry, but it is a fascinating story. Secondly, how Kanab, where I live, became a potential frac sand site. For those of you who may not be familiar with Kanab, it's literally right on the border with Arizona. So it's at the far southern border. It's primarily, and I'll come to this, it's primarily a tourist town. It's located roughly halfway between, well, closer to Zion, but between Zion and Grand Canyon. So you have a lot of people that go to visit one or both of those national parks, and they stay for a night or two in Kanab. I'll raise some issues with Kanab as to why, at least I would argue, I don't think it's a good site for frac sand. Arguably nowhere should be, but in any case, I'll say Kanab is particularly ill-suited. And then a bit about the politics. I've gotten to learn more about the politics of Kanab in southern Utah than I'd expected. I lived in Washington, D.C. for more than a quarter century. As you can imagine, I had some involvement in politics there. I didn't expect to be quite as involved in local politics here. Okay, first off, basic story on fracking. Most of you probably know the general picture. This is, a great breakthrough in terms of technology that it turns out we have all this oil and natural gas that's captured deep in rock, and fracking is a technique that allows them to get that oil, get that natural gas out. And it really has, hugely changed the industry, for good or bad. Obviously, it means we're burning a lot more fossil fuels, but a decade or so ago, maybe it was a little longer, it was common to hear people talking about peak oil, and some people were putting the dates of peak oil, 2015, 16, dates we've already passed, that we're going to hit our peak oil production, and then oil supply would decline, and the implication was prices would go through the roof. Well, it turns out because of fracking, we have way more oil and natural gas than people had envisioned, and we're seeing that go on in a very big way in the United States, but it's also going on in other places around the world. I should also point out, you could sort of see this with this diagram, obviously a very crude, simple diagram. There are different types of fracking. So you can have vertical fracking that just goes very deep into the rock. For our purposes, for sand, that uses less. You also have diagonal fracking that uses more, and then you have horizontal fracking that uses the most sand. So what you're shown here essentially is horizontal fracking. They're just going sideways. Okay, so growth of the industry. It really has, it's just totally changed the supply of oil in the United States. So the oil, we had oil coming from Alaska, coming from wells in Pennsylvania, Texas, and that was running dry. Actually, the ones in Pennsylvania probably been dry for 50 years, but in Texas, you still had wells, and it was thought, U.S. production was declining. And now that we have fracked oil, fracked natural gas, you see that production has just exploded. So in the case of oil, we're up around 4.7 million barrels a day. This is just from fracking. So this isn't counting our regular production of standard oil, traditional oil. And in the case of natural gas, we're up around 42 billion cubic feet. And if you want to convert that into barrels of oil, which I always do, there's 6,000 cubic feet of natural gas to a barrel of oil. So you're talking about the oil equivalent of about 7 million barrels a day in terms of natural gas. So that just radically changed the energy picture in the United States, and for that matter for the world, because the U.S. went from being a large importer of oil, we still import some, but we're now an exporter of oil and natural gas. So it radically changed, the world's energy supply. Again, from the standpoint of global warming, that's not a happy story, but if you want cheap gas, it's a happy story. Okay, next thing is fracking profitable. One of the issues with the fracking companies, I mean, just from a business perspective, this has been a real boom and bust story. So what you've seen is that you have a lot of places where they rush to drill wells, and they often find out that they're not profitable. And these are estimates. I can't vouch for the accuracy of them. It's from an energy company, RS Energy Group. You know, it's their analysis of the break-even point for oil for fracked oil in different basins around the country. And you can see that most of those, the break-even point is somewhere over 50. So Permian, Delaware, Permian, Midland, those are both in Texas. Those are very cheap, 45, 47. DJ Basin, which is in Colorado. Denver, I forget what the J stands for, but Denver something Basin. That's in Colorado. There it's 50. Eagle Ford is also in Texas, in South Texas. It's 52. Bakken is the North Dakota, which is very productive. North Dakota, Montana, 56. And Powder Basin in southeast Montana, Wyoming, it's 58. My point in putting this up here is that you could see, well, I don't know how close people follow world energy prices, world oil prices, but it's a marginal industry given these numbers. Let's assume for the moment that they're right, because I have no reason to assume otherwise. Oil has been as high in the recent past as $60, $70 a barrel. It's been as low as 40. At 40, none of these are profitable. Okay, at 60 or 70, all of them would be profitable. Okay, currently, I didn't pick up the look in the online this morning, but I think last I looked, it was like 58 a barrel. Okay, so they're all more or less profitable at that. But again, with oil prices fluctuating quite a bit, fracking goes in and out of profitability. And of course, even within this, there's enormous differences because you're drilling a well. Some you're lucky, some you're not. So you could have wells that they produce less than the average, in which case you're still going to lose out. Okay, and also the other thing with fracking is the amount of oil that you have in a well, the period of time you could drill is very uncertain. So you've had a lot of wells that have run dry or become relatively unproductive very quickly. Now those companies still, they're called stripper wells, they still sometimes drill for that. It still could be profitable to just get a small amount of oil or natural gas from one of these wells. But long and short, it's just a very boom and bust industry. It's not what you would think of as a stable long-term prospect. Okay, and that's before you talk about regulation, which, again, if one could envision stories where you have a different leadership in the White House where you would have regulation, in which case this picture would look much worse from the standpoint of the industry. Okay, so frac sand industry, there's a huge range around this. I was looking for different estimates. I was saying each well uses approximately 50,000 tons of frac sand per year. There's a huge range on that. So I was mentioning before that you have the vertical wells, directional, horizontal. Some of the horizontal wells could easily use over 100,000 tons of frac sand per year. So it's a huge, huge user of sand. And just to give some perspective, to put that in cubic feet, because most people aren't used to carrying around large amounts of sand. A cubic foot of sand weighs 96 pounds. Okay, so if you do the arithmetic on that, a ton of frac sand is 20 cubic feet. Okay, and you carry that out if you say 100 tons, so you have a big producer. That would be 2 million cubic feet. So if you envision a depth of the sand, let's say you're digging up sand and it has a depth of 10 feet. So we have a plot of sand and it's 10 feet deep. Well, that would correspond to 200,000 square feet of sand. Okay, so about 4 football fields. So that means that one well in 1 year, this would be a big user, but one well in 1 year would basically consume 4 football fields worth of sand. Okay, so they're very, very big users. The average output per well, again, huge range on this. Again, I don't claim to be very authoritative, but as best I could tell, the average well produces about 270 million barrels of oil a year, and the equivalent, or 600 million to 2 billion cubic feet of natural gas, which would be 100,000. That shouldn't be million barrels. 270,000 barrels. That would be an awful lot if it was doing 270,000 million barrels. I was looking at that. That's not right. So forget that million. 270,000 barrels of oil a year. Or alternatively, if it's a gas well, 600 million to 2 billion cubic feet, which is the equivalent of 100,000 to 330,000 barrels of oil. To give you references, converting the amount of sand, frac sand per well, making that meaningful per barrel, you'd have about a fifth of a ton per barrel, which comes to about $14 per barrel, given the retail price. So when you're getting a barrel of oil from fracking, about $14 of the price is from frac sand. Okay, so it's an important component of the price. Okay, so projections of frac sand usage. Again, the past we could be reasonably certain of. The future projections, their future projections. Yeah.
Just, can you speak for a moment about what happens to the sand once it's pumped into the well? I mean, if these huge quantities, what happens with all of that sand?
That's a really good question. I think they're just leaving it there. So you're using, the whole thing is you're doing this very high pressure oil and gas, oil and sand, and chemicals too. I should have added in this because this is one of the big issues with fracking, that you use chemicals which, because of a law that was passed, I think it was in 2005, there was an amendment to the Clean Drinking Water Act. They don't have to disclose the chemicals. So fracking has this, it was done, don't ask me how or why, the why is obvious, but don't ask me how they managed to do this. Republicans controlled Congress, Bush was in the White House, Cheney was, of course, his vice president, was in the oil industry. So anyhow, they got an exemption from the for fracking. They don't have to disclose the chemicals. But my understanding, I think they actually just leave it there.
But the water comes back out largely, right? There's this thing.
Yeah, so the water comes out. I don't know if they pull the sand out, because you're shoving it down. So my guess, and I'm saying that without really knowing the process fully, that I think they just leave it there because I think it'd be kind of pain to pull it out. So I don't, and obviously they're not looking for any extra expense. They're not going to try and do any, they're not going to do anything they don't have to. So if the cheapest thing is to just, you're shoving the sand down there, you just leave it there, then that's what they would do. So that's what I assume. I can't say for certain, but I hadn't, let me put it this way, if they did pull it out, then that would be a big expense. How do you dispose of it? And I just haven't heard of that being an issue. So my guess is that they do leave it there. I can't swear to that, but that'd be my guess. Okay, so in terms of past and future usage, you can see that these projections are showing usage to just go through the roof. And it expands hugely almost everywhere, and that's basically based on fracking expanding everywhere. So these projections, and again, these come from the industry. I can't, not in a position to analyze them independently, but they show fracking expanding hugely, particularly in Texas, but really just about everywhere across the country, everywhere that now has fracking. So they're projecting a huge expansion in fracking, corresponding as frac sand usage. Now, you do also tend to, as a well gets older, you tend to use more sand per output of oil or output of natural gas. So that is part of the story. But most of the story is just a huge increase in usage that they're projecting over time. Okay, so again, likely a different story if we have a change in control in the White House in 2021, but at least, this is a baseline that, people in the industry are looking at. I'll just put it that way. Okay, frac sand prices. This is promising for those of us in Kanab. Frac sand prices were very high 2012, 2013, and 14. World oil prices plummeted. Okay, and that meant cheaper gas and everything. That also meant that much less fracking activity and much less need for frac sand. So this is Bureau of Labor Statistics, Producer Price Index. So I'm happy to, I was surprised that I'm real consumer of price indices from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So I just thought, well, why don't I look and see if they have an index? And sure enough, they had an index for frac sand. So, what I like about that, of course, is I trust the source. If it's an industry source, well, it's an industry source. Maybe it's right, maybe it's not. Bureau of Labor Statistics tries to be very, very careful in their data. So basically what they're showing is that frac sand prices fell by 30% from their peaks in 2014 to 2015, 2016. So a lot of frac sand that might have been profitable at the prices in 2014 clearly wasn't profitable in 2015, 2016. It rose somewhat, again, following world oil prices. So there was a rise in world oil prices, 2016, 2017. Anyone who follows the investment data closely, you see there was an increase in investment in 2016, 2017, most of that was increase, in that increase was due to the energy industry. Okay, so oil prices went up. That meant more drilling activity, more supplies for the oil industry. That was far and away the biggest source of that uptick in investment. Well, oil prices then again fell in the last year or two, and frac sand prices fell with that. And you can see the most recent prices there are actually below the troughs that they hit back in 2015. And this data goes through July. The August data came out on Tuesday, and I'm happy to say it fell another 10%. Okay, so frac sand prices have fallen a lot. Okay, and frac sand company stock prices, well, they've fallen a lot. So these are the listed companies. Obviously, not all the frac sand companies are listed on the stock exchange, but these presumably are the largest ones. Generally, the largest ones are public companies that they're listed. And as you can see, the prices of these stocks have both fallen in the last year, and they're down hugely from their levels of 5 years ago, 2014, before oil prices had fallen. So these, I took these as of August 28th. So you can see in the last year, High Crush Incorporated, their price had fallen 86% in the last year. It's down 96.9% from where it was 5 years ago. Covia Holdings, down 87.2% in the last year, down 92.2% from where it was 5 years ago. And Emerge Energy Services, they filed for bankruptcy in July. I was very frustrated. I kept looking for them because I've been following these companies for a while. So I go, what the hell is it? And the reason why it wasn't there was bankrupt. Yeah.
What ballpark would be the percentage of the cost of fracking associated with frac sand?
If you use those numbers, that profitability is around mid-50s, depending on where you're looking, then frac sand would be around 25%, 25 to 30%. So it's a very good chunk of the cost.
So why is the profitable price constant if you see this kind of fall? Or wouldn't that mean that there'd be fluctuations?
Yeah, well, those prices, that wasn't prices through time. That was
That was a specific point in time, I understand.
yeah, so that was.
It is interesting to sort of ponder as to how that moves around.
Yeah, no, that certainly would be a factor. So I'm assuming that was December 2018, so I'm assuming that was based on.
It's already reflected.
Yeah. So, and insofar as prices have fallen a little further since then, which they have, then, maybe knock a couple percent, 2 or 3% off those prices. But it also means, just to go back, important point, that if we were to look at break-even points, if you go back to, say, 2014, when frac sand prices were 30% higher, then these prices would all have to be about 7, 8, 9% higher, in terms of their profitability.
Do you think that this RS Energy Group was taking the current conditions as of 2018 to determine the profitability, or were they using something from sort of an earlier era? I mean, it's interesting.
I don't know if they took that day's prices.
These sound like numbers that I've been hearing about for decades.
Yeah.
In terms of,
That's a good question. I don't know how careful. They might have tried to take some average, so it would make sense. You wouldn't take the daily price, but you might have said, okay, what's the average price been over the last, 3 or 4 years? So I can't say for certain what they did, but it probably wasn't literally that day's price, but it might have been somewhat higher than, than what it had been 2018. Okay, so frac sand, long and short, my reason for showing this is it's not been a very profitable industry. So, again, there were one or two other companies I found that were also listed that I didn't include them because they weren't just frac sand, so I didn't include them. So these are the ones I know that are pure frac sand, yeah.
Well, this doesn't necessarily show that it's not profitable, although I guess the one that's filed bankruptcy is. This could have showed that there was a huge bubble 5 years ago, and people had thought that they were going to be amazingly profitable, and it turned out they were only modestly profitable.
No, that's a fair comment. So it's at least much less profitable than people had expected as of 2014. And actually, since it's fallen a lot in the last year, as of, the summer of 2018. So, but yeah, it doesn't mean that you can't make a profit in the frac sand industry, but just much, much less than people had anticipated some years back. Okay, so how did Kanab become a potential source? Well, in the early days of the fracking industry, the vast majority of the sand came from Wisconsin. And I feel stupid for not having known that because I grew up in Chicago and, you know, did summer camp in Wisconsin, so it's kind of my backyard sort of. And I never knew a thing about this. So it turns out that Wisconsin has all these hills that are sandstone. And you could tear up the hills and get sand from them. And that's where most of the sand had come from in the early years of the fracking industry. Now, what subsequently happened as fracking moved south to Texas, and to some extent I'll come to this, New Mexico, and we have some up here in the Uinta Basin in Utah, most of the cost of the sand, the frac sand, was transportation. Okay, and when you're bringing it from Wisconsin to Texas, you're talking about 1,400 miles. Most of that they go by rail, but you do typically have to truck it to the rail depot, and then you also have to take it from the rail depot to the frac site. Okay, so rough cost trucking is 40 to 50 cents per ton mile. The rail is about a tenth that, so it's much, much cheaper to do it by rail than to do it by truck. But the wisdom in the industry, I'm saying this from industry publications, and best I could tell looking doing some calculations, that basically 1/3 of the cost is the sand, 1/3 of the cost when you have a long haul by rail is the long haul by rail, and the other third, their term last mile, that it's putting it on the truck, bringing it to the depot. Okay, so when you're bringing it from Wisconsin to Texas, you're paying an awful lot for the trucking. Well, when you start fracking in Texas, in Utah, there's some in Colorado, you start to think, can you get closer? And there's a lot of sites, frac sand sites, that have opened up in Texas, in basin, and you're now looking at sites in frac sand sites in Utah. Okay, and a big factor here in 2014, so that was the peak, whether it was a bubble or whatever, but certainly much higher frac sand prices. In 2014, SITLA, which I should know what it stands for, School Institutional Trust Land Authority. Okay, so they did a study of all their land to see where they had good quality sand for fracking. So there's ideal sand for fracking, that it has to be strong, you need the right dimensions, it shouldn't be too big, too small. Turns out Kanab does very, very well by that criteria. So we have this area, this plateau just above Kanab that I'll show you in a moment, and that turns out to do very well by that criteria. So that's how people started to look at Kanab as a site for potential frac sand operations. Okay, this is just a story in Wisconsin. There's again, this is one of the things that I've had occasion to learn about since we had this proposal for the frac sand mine in Kanab, that what they've done in Wisconsin. Someone wrote a book on this called "When the Hills Are Gone," because they're literally getting rid of the hill. That's this is halfway through. When they're done, the hill's going to be gone. Another thing about Wisconsin, it's a little different from Kanab. In the case of Kanab, it's about 8 miles outside of town. In Wisconsin, these are literally in town. So people have a frac sand mine put up across the street from them, in some cases across schools, so it's as bad as we might think it is in Kanab. It's a worse story in Wisconsin. Okay, so issues with the Kanab site. It's really, I would say it's an extraordinary area. I'll show you pictures in a moment. It's about 10 miles. The boundaries of their site is about 10 miles from Zion National Park. It's an area, people go up there all the time. My wife and I, since we've lived in Kanab a little over a year, we've probably been hiking there 10, 15 times. I mean, people go hiking there. They do, I'm not a fan of ATVs, but they go up there with ATVs. They're hunters. It's a widely used recreation area. And people come, I was mentioning, Kanab's a tourist site. Oftentimes people, when they spend a night in Kanab, they'll arrange for a tour to go up to some of the sites in this area. Native American artifacts, it's very common if you go hiking there, you find, a arrowhead or some other Native American artifact there. This area is Native Americans have lived there for hundreds of years. So needless to say, there's an awful lot of them. Water, we're in the desert. A frac sand mine uses a huge amount of water because what they do at the mine, the processing plant, I should say, you have to clean the sand. So you want it ready to be used in frac. So you have to filter it, want to get rid of the grains that are too big, get rid of the ones that are too small, and then clean the rest so that you just have sand. So they're just putting sand down into the wells. Uses a lot of water. 1,200 acre-feet is what they've contracted for, and by comparison, that's about 80% of the city's annual usage. So it's a considerable amount of water. truck traffic. Their plant is proposed to have a capacity of 3 million tons, and if you do the arithmetic on it, a truck comes in, comes out, comes to 650 trucks a day, or one every 2 minutes. So that's if they're operating at capacity. They may well not be, but obviously they're building a 3 million capacity, 3 million tons, with the idea that they'll be operating somewhere close to that. That's obviously their intention. Tourism's our business. Ken Gardner Public Policy Institute here, they put tourism jobs at 40% of our total jobs. That really understates in the sense that, what are the other jobs? Well, we have a hospital, we have a school. Well, if you didn't have the tourist industry, there wouldn't be anyone going to the hospital, there wouldn't be anyone going to school. So tourism is the industry. And also, you have people like my wife and I, we're semi-retired, we moved there because it's this beautiful place. We probably wouldn't have moved there if you had a big frac sand mine and trucks going through town every 2 minutes, So, it is the bread and butter of the town. Also, mining claims run right up to the boundary of Best Friends Animal Sanctuary, which is this huge animal sanctuary, another reason that we moved there, and the mine claims go right up against the boundary of it. So just to give you some of the sites, Diana's Throne, the claims go right up against Diana's Throne, so they can mine right to Diana's Throne. They're insisting that they have no plans to, but you got mining rights, presumably with the idea that you might use them. So what they end up using or not, who knows? They don't know, we don't know. But they obviously thought they might use them or they wouldn't have bothered to get the rights. Peekaboo Canyon. This is another tourist attraction. People come from all over to see Peekaboo Canyon. It's this really cool slot canyon, very colorful, has petroglyphs on the wall. Again, the mining claims go right up against Peekaboo Slot Canyon. And Best Friends Animal Sanctuary. So again, the mining claims go right up against the boundaries of Best Friends Animal Sanctuary. So just to be clear, their claim is, we have no intention, I'll try to avoid going too far off in this. They say we have no intention on going through all these areas. They have claims, mining claims for 12,000 acres of Bureau of Land Management land. They say they're just going to do the Sitla parcel. And their claim, the reason why they got these other claims for the 12,000 acres is they didn't want anyone else to get this great sand. Now, the big problem with that story is who would get it? You need to process it. You need water. You wouldn't have water because they got, and I'll come to this, they got the water that Kanab has to sell and probably then some. So it's not clear that anyone else could get that sand. So the idea that they did this just to get others from being able to use it, it really is implausible. Yeah.
So did they buy the Sitla land and lease
The-
the
the-
land? Or?
No, they have a lease on the Sitla land. So it's also, they've contracted to be able to mine there. Okay, so local politics, our players. Southern Red Sands is the name of the company that is applying, that is looking to set up the operation. You don't have to have much disclosure about companies in Utah, but we did do the homework we could. So Southern Red Sands used to be Integrated Sands, before that it was Integrated Logistics, which was originally founded by T.M. Martin, who's the son-in-law of Ken Gardner. Okay, so we don't know the current connection of Mr. Martin or Ken Gardner exactly to the mine, but that was the origins. The head of, the CEO of Southern Red Sands, Chad Stahaley. The chief operating officer of Southern Red Sands is Andy Gant, who's one of our 3 county commissioners, and he also oversees the county planning commission, which we'll come to. They had to approve a conditional operating permit. Mike Noel, who's kind of the devil in persona. He's the head of the Kane County Water Conservancy District. I should say I never met Mike Noel. I still haven't met him. I had the occasion to see him twice at public meetings. Once we had a hydrologist giving a report, and he got up and started answering questions, and repeatedly people had to say, "We came to hear the hydrologist. Could you know?" The other time he got thrown out because he got in a fight with someone. So anyhow, so he's an interesting character. So he's also the brother-in-law of Andy Gant and the father-in-law by marriage of Chad Stahaley. So he remarried, and his second wife is the mother of Chad Stahaley's wife. And then Ken Gardner, who we don't know the exact connection, but again, according to Mike Noel, he's the person behind the Southern Red Sands. And we also know they share an office here in Salt Lake City. So if you look at the legal documents when they signed the water contract, it was literally the same office that the Gardner Company has in Salt Lake City. So there's clearly some connection there, whatever exactly is, we don't know. Okay, so dealing with the issue, city water. Mike Noel, as head of the Kane County Water Conservancy District, signed a contract to sell 600 acre-feet of water a year to Southern Red Sands. And he said that if the city, because they came to the city and asked them to sell another 600 acres, they said, if the city doesn't sell it, then I'll just sell the other 600 acres. So in other words, it doesn't matter what you do. We're going to get the water anyhow. I'll come back to that. Okay, so then the city made a decision, city council made a decision, are they going to sell the water? Well, state law prohibits them from selling water outside the boundaries of the city, and this mine's about 8 miles outside the boundaries of the city. It's on that plateau that I showed you, unless you have a surplus. So what's their evidence that they have a surplus? Well, they had a study by the Utah Geological Survey that was some calculations, and it was almost humorous because at the city council meeting where they agreed to sell the water, they had the 2 hydrologists who had done the study. And they said, you can't make any decisions based on this. This is just very preliminary. They hadn't done any careful calculations looking at the geography. So they just flat out said, you cannot use this study as a basis to sell water. So then the mayor came up and said, well, I have this study that shows we have a huge amount of water. I'll show that to you in a second. And the third study, which we don't have yet, Best Friends commissioned a study from a hydrologist, which is apparently a well-respected hydrologist, is doing a very careful study. We don't have that yet, unfortunately. Hopefully we'll have that soon. Let me show you the study used by the mayor. How does that come out? Yeah. Okay, you could see that. The mayor cited this study, and he said, look, we have 114,000 acre-feet of water a year. And he was waving around. He has a thick document because it's, I don't know, probably 200 pages or something. He's waving that around. I have this study. Shows we have 114,000 acre-feet of water. So I'm going, wow, that's really something, because you want to sell 600. That's nothing, right? So a friend of mine said, no, that study doesn't show that, and he sent me this chart, which is literally the chart he was using. That was a range. The bottom end of the range was 8,700 acre-feet. We're like, come on, folks, you know, that's not serious. And guess what? That was a recharge rate. The same table has a discharge rate. So, you know, back where I come from, you subtract the discharge from the recharge. And what you get from that is, well, it's not clear you have anything. You might already be in deficit. So this is what he was citing. Okay, so that's, you know, to my view, at least not very serious that you have a surplus. Okay, yeah.
By the way, the official position of the Kane County Water Conservancy District vis-a-vis the proposed Lake Powell pipeline is that, of course, Kane County has an important deficit of water, which is going to get worse and worse.
Yeah, for people who aren't familiar with it, there's this proposal to have a pipeline from Lake Powell that would divert a lot of water to, it would go to St. George, would be the major recipient, but we would also be a recipient. And Mike Noel is a big proponent of that. And he said, we're in the desert, we need water. And then somehow, because if you look at the project, if you just look at the road, it's trivial. You know, it's not going to be a big impact. If you look at the full project, including the drainage of water, there's an issue where you have some lakes just below the site which are home to the Kanab amber snail, which is an endangered species. So they may well be jeopardizing the survival of the Kanab amber snail. For those of us who are older here, we may remember the snail darter. That was a fish in Tennessee that impeded the development of a dam that they were going to put up impeded for about 7 or 8, 9 years. Congress eventually changed the law. They put an exemption to say they could go ahead and build the dam. But the Endangered Species Act says if you're going to, you know, threaten the existence of endangered species, you can't do it. So anyhow, the Kanab amber snail may well be in that boat. And the last sort of major item, water divergence that, you know, again, the law does state pretty clearly, I've talked to a number of lawyers on this, and they don't think there's any ambiguity, that the city's not allowed to sell water unless they have a surplus. So right now, the city, I mean, like in the last week, the city had applied for a water divergence. That can be contested, and we fully intend to do that. You know, perhaps the Sanctuary Ranch does as well. but we fully intend to contest whether they have the water to sell. And any one of these, in principle, could block the sand mine from going through. The other factor, you know, these are obviously business people. They care about making money. And the story with frac sand prices is that it doesn't look really good for them making money. So first and foremost, you need a market. As I said, they were originally looking to the market in the Uinta Basin. That's gone now. You have this site near Vernal. It's very hard to see how they're going to be able to get any sales in the Uinta Basin. The other potential market that they have that they've talked about is in the San Juan Basin in New Mexico, that there's a relatively small fracking operation there. Obviously it could grow, but there's a relatively small fracking operation that they could in principle sell sand to. Problem from their vantage point is that the roads from Kanab to the San Juan Basin are just not very good. It's not interstate. You'd be going through the Navajo Nation. You're going through some back roads. They're very curvy. They're snow covered in winter. So you're looking at a trip of probably about 350 miles. And you'd be competing with sand from Texas, which is further away, but most of that could go by rail. So they can cover most of that distance by rail. So, you know, my best guess is that they probably would not be able to beat out the West Texas sand for that market. So if they don't have a market there, that's going to make it unlikely they'll want to go there. The last point that I should have mentioned earlier, these whole operations have very large upfront capital costs. So to build a processing plant probably costs a neighborhood of $60 million. Okay, so if you're uncertain of your market, you know, in other words, if they knew they could operate this at 3 million tons a year, they almost certainly could recoup that cost. But if you're talking about a situation where, you know, maybe you'd only sell 500,000, 600,000, 700,000, you'd just be operating a small percentage of capacity, you're not going to be able to recoup that cost. So between the potential of these suits to, you know, at least slow it down, if not actually stop it, and the underlying economics in the industry, we think there's a decent chance that, you know, they'll never go forward, but we'll see. I should mention one other thing that, yeah, no.
A superb overview. Dan, I was wondering, if tourism is such a large facet of the Kanab and the broader economy there, why isn't there some business community that has coalesced to take on a larger role in battling this kind of, are they just small potatoes compared to these folks?
Well, they are small potatoes, certainly, say, compared to Gardner. I mean, SRS is a startup company, so I don't know how deep their pockets are. But, you know, compared to Gardner, they're small potatoes. But what's going on, the devil here, there's an establishment, you know, as you could gather. So these are people that, you know, they're great-grandparents. They were founders of the town. They go back to the 1870s. And they're behind the project. So you do find people in town who say, well, you know, I'm opposed to it, but I really can't stick my neck out. So, and that's particularly true of the businesses, because they don't want to lose customers. So, you know, we have 2 grocery stores in town, and they're worried that, you know, if they speak up, I'm not saying that they're necessarily opposed, but, you know, they're in a situation, if they spoke up publicly, they're worried that, you know, they would be targeted by the community, you know, the pillars of the community, I should say. So it does have a quieting effect. Now, we have hotels in town. Most of them are chains. And their view is, well, we don't really want to get involved in the local politics. So the people who manage the hotels or motels, you know, many of them are saying, yeah, this is a really bad idea, but I can't speak up. So it's, I mean, we may be able to overcome that, but that's kind of where it stands now.
It was the hotel piece of it that I was particularly interested in.
Yeah, it's peculiar. It's not dynamic. It would have occurred to me, but we see it. Yeah.
So there was an analogous project done by Tory and Zizio for a quarry that was on Sittler land that actually was stopped. And I think there's a nonprofit that's going to buy it and send it to review. Are you familiar with that?
No, I should get some info from you after this, but
Yeah.
it sounds like they might have some good advice for us.
It actually forced some changes, and I'm not quite sure what they were on the CBP over the whole course of about a 2-year debate and fight down there. But ultimately the interlopers won.
Well, that's good. That's good to hear. That's also, again, speaking a little bit more about the dynamics in town, my wife and I are obviously very new there, but you have a lot of people that have been there 20 or 30 years. They're still thought to be outsiders. So you have the people, as I say, generations have been there. They're the town. And Mike Noah got up at one of these meetings, and he literally said that. He goes, the people who are opposed to this, they're not from around here. Again, that's fair to say about my wife and I. We got there a year ago. But, as I say, you have people who've been there 20, 30 years. It's a little like, okay, at some point, this is your community. So, yes?
Oh, I want to make an eye comment on that number 4, section 2, one word that is not a law. It's part of the Utah state constitution. And so, in order, that's based on, that they can't tell what.
Okay.
The city can't. And that's in the constitution.
Well, that should make it pretty good standing. No, the lawyers I've talked to, and it's possible they told me that, and I just went in out one ear out the other, but that's good to know. So obviously this is well established. As I said, I've talked to a couple lawyers, and they all knew like that. And again, maybe they had mentioned it was in the Constitution. I didn't recall that, but it's they clearly knew about that. And no, one of the lawyers I had spoke with said, I can't imagine what the city's going to say, because they don't, as I understand it, the burden is on them to show they have a surplus. And the way the contract actually worked, it's 30 years with 2 options for 10-year renewals. So they would, in principle, have to show that they have a surplus, not just for 2019 or 2020, but for the next 50 years. And they have nothing. There's nothing they can produce that shows they have the surplus. Again, we're going to get this hydrologist report that Best Friend commissioned, and we'll see what that shows. He did a preliminary presentation. He was being very careful not to comment beyond his analysis, but based on the his preliminary indication, it didn't look like we had a large surplus. Yeah.
So I may have missed this, but when were these mining rights acquired? And were they acquired specifically for the sand mining operation, or was this like fungible and moved on to?
It's a great question. I learned about this. My wife and I were hiking up there once, and we're going, what is this? Because there's this post, and we looked at this, and it says claim something or other. So there's a whole industry of speculators. So people get claims where obviously they think there might be some value to them. So they get mining claims with no intention whatsoever of using them, but they're hoping that someone's going to later decide that they're useful. So what happened was, I'm sure someone got a hold of the Sitla study. It's public, so anyone who wanted to could have gotten that. So they probably, they saw that this area above Kanab was very highly rated for the quality of its sand. So they decided, oh yeah, we should take out a lot of claims there. And before our guys, Southern Red Sands, got the mining rights, there was another company, Western Sands, that originally bought up all these claims. They later sold them to Southern Red Sands. We found, again, in doing our research, it's kind of funny because we found the, prospectus for Western Sands, and they were talking about what a great site this is, and they said, we don't have to worry about political opposition. So that was a great motivator for people in Kanab. Like, yeah, well, that might not be quite right, but yeah. So as I say, I had no idea people did that. It makes sense when you think about it, but I didn't realize that there's this whole industry of basically mining speculators that they buy claims and with the hope that subsequently they'll become valuable.
So could those rights be terminated? Is there any? Is that one of the options up there?
It's there are rules under which you can terminate them, but I don't think anything we could come up with. One of the things I've discovered, I already knew this a little bit, but I know more having lived there, is that BLM is incredibly mining friendly. The joke is it's the Bureau of Leasing and Mining. So they don't. So again, I don't know if there's any regulation or law that would cause them problems, but BLM looks the other way wherever they can. So one of the things we see that you have cattle grazing everywhere in BLM land, and it totally decimates the land. And the cattle industry, because they're powerful lobbyists, that they're able to get away with it. The whole story you know the story of Michael Bundy. Is it Michael Bundy? Whatever, you know, that's what that was all about. He had grazing cattle on BLM land and not even paying. I mean, it's, you know, what they pay is a fraction of the damage that they cause, so they should probably pay 20 times, you know, if you were actually going to allow it. They probably should pay, but he wasn't paying anything at all. And at the end of the day, they backed down. He got away with it, you know, so.
Just to piggyback on Good Sully's question, historically, are those boundaries set going back into perpetuity, or do they, for example, I mean, if something is declared a national monument or a national park, I mean, clearly those are not going to be eligible for some of this activity. And so I just, you know, but as close as they are to these amazing natural landmarks of beauty, I wonder how far back these rights really extend historically. I wonder what the nature of those boundaries have been.
Well, when they desert land, so there's relatively little value to it. So basically, the government sort of became the residual. I don't think it was intentional. I haven't gone back to read the original documents, but I don't think it was intentional that the government would have claim to it. Now, in terms of it being parkland or monument, yeah, I mean, this is an extraordinary area, so it would be reasonable to say, you know, we want to protect this in some way. Obviously, in the Trump administration, that's not going to happen. You could envision, though, that, you know, a different administration in 2021 could say that. You know, I mean, it's sort of mind-boggling when you go around there. I don't mean just this land, but, you know, probably true up here too, but obviously I'm less familiar with Salt Lake City. There's so many really beautiful areas that you're allowing to be, you know, overrun by cattle, which, you know, I'm an economist. I'm sympathetic to the idea we don't want to, you know, strangle the economy, keep people from having jobs. It's an incredibly marginal industry. You know, cattle grazing, particularly on BLM land, they're not making money hand over fist. And, you know, if you didn't have an effective subsidy from the government, they just wouldn't do it. So it's one of these things that, you know, from the standpoint of resource management, just saying, you know, I mean, I'd be fine saying, okay, here's the damage you actually caused. So you're going to have to pay 20 times what you now pay for grazing your cattle. Do you want to do it? And of course, they wouldn't. But either doing that or outlawing it. But, you know, you could be a good market economist and just say, okay, pay for the damage, and we'll let you do it. But, you know, they get away with it. It's, you know, and it's one of these things where there's an incredible mythology about it. You know, everyone's sympathetic to the cowboy and the West and this and that. And, you know, Paul Krugman had a great column about Bundy, you know, I don't know, 7, 8, 9 years ago, where he headlined it High Plains Grifter. You know, because it's the exact opposite. You aren't some tough independent guy. You want the government to subsidize this land for you. And, you know, it is just really, you know, from any perspective, you know, from an economic perspective, from being concerned about the environment, it's just an incredibly absurd policy. And they get away with it because, you know, they're a powerful group here in, you know, places like Utah, Wyoming. You know, they're a powerful group. And, you know, most people don't have much interest in, you know, before I moved out here, you know, I had some idea, you know, I knew Bundy, but I didn't realize how serious the story was. You're just literally talking about tens of millions of acres that are being overrun by cattle, again, for no good reason. I mean, I would understand if, you know, that meant the price of beef would go up by $1 or $2. I mean, arguably we shouldn't be eating so much beef or whatever, but, you know, that aside, you know, that's a lot out of people's pocketbook. The fact is people do eat beef. So, you know, I would understand that argument, but you go, no, this would trivially affect the price of beef, if at all. It's a very small share of, you know, the beef cattle in the United States. So there just really is no argument on the other side. It's just, you know, these people have a lot of power and they're able to preserve that. Yeah.
Are all of the claims on BLM or are some of them on CITLA land?
Oh, that's a good point. I should have been clearer. So their initial claims are CITLA land. CITLA is about 600 acres, that parcel. There's actually another CITLA parcel. It's also 600 acres. And their claim is, oh, we only intend to do the CITLA land. And that's important because, again, when they're applying for the conditional use permit, well, what exactly is the project? And they're saying, oh, it's just the CITLA land. And again, you know, we backed out some numbers. We don't know exactly how deep the sand is, but, you know, using what we think are reasonable numbers, they should get through the CITLA land in 2 or 3 years. They're signing leases for 30 years with a 20-year extension. They're not planning on leaving after 2 or 3 years. They wouldn't be able to recoup the cost. There's no way. So they're obviously planning to go on the BLM land. And, you know, our guess is once they were through, let's say, you know, we go through all these court cases, all these appeals, and they get a green light, there's nothing left to stop them, then they'll probably immediately file for permission to mine on the BLM land.
Because the Sitla land is operated very different from the BLM.
Yeah,
If you did have a miner project called Sitla, they would buy Sitla out, they would give them other parcels throughout our state. So that equals, those are two different things, and I think the Sitla land, the opposition to it, Sitla land is different from BLM land, what the board.
yeah, no, it's definitely different. I'm not sure, most people have led me to believe that you have less hope of getting anywhere if you're trying to cause pressure on Sitla than BLM.
Their goal is to maximize the income for our schools.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, one of the lawyers explained that to us, that all they have to do is say, this gets us the most money, end of story, you know, so, yeah.
Is there an argument in Kanab that this has to be done because of the jobs impact?
There's a very small number of people who will say that. You know, they originally were talking about 90 jobs. You know, we did our research, you know, we looked at Wisconsin. The average mine in Wisconsin employs like 34 people. So you're telling us you're going to employ 3 times as many? It sounds like a money-losing operation, you know. So they've scaled that back, so they're now talking about 40, which is ballpark. I mean, who knows exactly how many? So that's not an absurd number. And, you know, one of the points we've made is some of these are highly specialized jobs, so this clearly wouldn't go to people who live in Kanab. So maybe we're talking about 25, outside 30, which, you know, there's population's 4,500, so it's not altogether trivial. On the other hand, you know, even a small hit to the tourist industry will swamp that, you know. And so, you know, as I say, people have said that. How many people really believe it? I mean, there was one guy who showed up at both the city council meeting, because they have a public speaking sessions. They spoke at both the city council meeting and the county planning commission meeting. He was wearing this big cowboy hat, and I knew some people were kind of laughing because one woman was going, you know, my grandfather was a rancher. He never wore his hat inside, you know, but he kept on the whole time, you know. So anyhow, he was saying, this is good because it's going to create jobs. And, you know, we were asking, does anyone know him? You know, so someone did talk to him, and he said he had apparently been a driver for one of the companies. So I don't know if he was literally paid to be there, but it doesn't seem like he was a longtime resident who was really concerned about the, you know, the economy of Kanab. Yes?
Another side comment on the mining plant. Salt Lake City owns, essentially, this goes back before you Salt Lake State. It owns all the water in the mountains. And consequently, there are all strict rules on the mountains. With Trump, there was a proposal put forth by our congressman, maybe 2 years ago, to open up Carterport, which people around here know, there are lots and lots of mining claims dotting all that. So to open them up, contrary to the Salt Lake City rules, which preserve the water, so that they could have a special exemption of those properties, those hotels there in Carterport, which is totally destroyed.
So do they have authorization to do that now?
And U.S. Congress voted it down.
Oh,
But it's still hanging on
that's
to
interesting.
commercialize big cotton candy.
It is amazing. I mean, some of these proposals almost seem like they're designed, you know, like the goal is to destroy the environment.
And these are all, you know, got these little mining plots around the canyon, and they can make a lot of money on
Yeah.
it. It's a-
Yes, maybe we could have time for one more question.
Yes?
So, a lot of your experience, from what I understand, has been in federal government,
Yeah.
federal policy, and now that you're working in a very, very small town, what things are different, and what have you found to be surprising?
That's a really good question. One is just the very narrow political dynamics of Kanab. So this whole thing, you know, with, you know, the old timers and, you know, kind of, as I say, you'll have people say, well, I agree with you, this is a bad idea, but I can't say anything publicly. You know, it wasn't too common in D.C. I don't know, I suppose if I knew a Trump supporter, they wouldn't want to say that publicly in D.C., you know, but you know, but you didn't have that sort of thing, at least not that I ever saw. the other thing is, not that you don't have a lot of ridiculous stuff that goes on in Congress, because I've seen a lot, but I mean, standing up there with the study, I mean, when the mayor's waving this study and going, look, we have this study that shows we have 114,000 acre feet, and, you know, again, no one's got a copy of it, so I know what he's waving, you know, and then when you actually see, no, that doesn't show that at all. It shows, you know, there's nothing at all like that. You don't get to just take the highest number on a range, ignore the discharge. I should also point out, I even mentioned this, that was for the whole plateau, not the whole plateau, the whole watershed going from the Paria River in the east to the Hurricane Fault in the west. It's probably 100 miles. So, you know, maybe the part that is reasonably Kanab is maybe a tenth that, maybe less. I mean, so it's a little hard. As again, there are some members of Congress who could do things like that, but that would really be the exception. So, excuse me?
Mike B has this, I don't know, slideshow on dragons and.
Oh, you did have our senator here got up the solution to global warming was babies. I'm dead serious, not Romney. Yeah, he literally, and he had a picture of babies. So anyhow, but again, that's more the exception. In Kanab, you know, it's, you know, I think members of Congress would be reluctant to try to get away with some of the things that, you know, we're seeing the politicians in Kanab get away with. So.
All right. Well, thank you very much for coming to the Thinkers.